Hey, this is Vu, and today I'm going to be talking about how to in-game lead. And there's a lot to do about in-game leading. Now, the in-game leader does do quite a few things. First of all, he's going to do the standard, which is strat calling, and he's just going to be calling in game. But also what he needs to be doing is being very proactive in not only the strats that he's using, but also the position his teammates are playing, as well as the overall strategy the team is going for, and several other things like that. So it's very important that the in-game leader not only focuses on his strats, but also between rounds, he talks to his teammates, asks them what they think went wrong in a certain round, asks them what they did there, even review demos and see what went wrong, why a strat's not working. More or less, the in-game leader has to play the most CS out of his entire team. Of course, unless you're all playing like 8 hours a day, but he needs to be analyzing CS generally the most, and a lot of the time, he needs to know the most about CS. A lot of in-game leaders are going to be on teams where they just naturally know more about what you should be doing in certain scenarios, and so an in-game leader, when good, wants to be getting the best out of every single one of his players, and he can be doing that by showing them a cool pop flash, a different way to play their spot, a different strategy. For example, if you're playing a map like Overpass, you might have the idea that in general, when your team goes down 4-on-5, that you want to try and get some control of short B or something like that, just as an example, where it's not you calling it in the middle of the round, it's you showing your team what you want the strategy to be, and then your team executing that without you needing to call it. So it's just something that you kind of push onto your team, and that's an overarching strategy. Now, I'm not going to go over that too much more. Rather, I'm going to be talking more about actual in-game leading, which is, I'll just call it strat calling, and what you need to be doing as an in-game leader in terms of strat calling. And I'm going to be using Dust 2 as the example map here. However, it's just here as an example. It can be used for any other map. Most of the ideas that I'm going to be giving you here are going to be applicable on nearly every map out there, so you don't need to think that this is only applicable on Dust 2. Now, for the most part, starting out here, there are a few types of strats you need to know, and I have a whole series on this, but generally you want to have a default and a couple of executes off the default, a couple of standard executes off of just the beginning of the map. On Dust 2, you don't generally have too many standard executes where you just straight up execute into a site right in the beginning, but on a lot of other maps like Inferno or Overpass, Mirage, whatnot, you don't always go into a default, so you need to have multiple executes. You also need to have, of course, pistol strats on both sides, and eco and anti-eco strats. So you've got a wide variety of things you want to do. Now, of course, your default, a lot of people get their defaults wrong. Now, the difference between a default and working picks is that a default is intended to get map control so that you can do something else, and getting picks is just kind of something that will happen. It's not the end goal in most defaults. So, for example, a standard default would be to send 2 guys through lower tunnels, 1 guy upper tunnels, 1 guy outside long, and 1 guy opping T-spawn. And then the guy outside long can come over here, flash his team out lower so he doesn't have to deal with this player boosted up on cat like this. Of course, you want to throw that flash a little bit better, but what happens there, he flashes them out, they come over here, someone flashes them around the corner on cat, and then all of a sudden they have cat control, and they've got a decent control of the map with control of every area, and if they're in a 5-on-5, they then do an execute on a site. That's generally how a default is going to work on this map in particular, but it also works pretty similarly on most maps. Now, on certain maps, for example, Mirage or Overpass as well, your default is oftentimes going to get you kills or get you killed. So you end up in a 4-on-4 or a 4-on-3 or a 3-on-4 or something like that, because it's more dangerous to take control of those areas on those maps. However, on Dust 2, a lot of teams will just give up cat. So a decent portion of the time, if this is run correctly and you don't get one player just randomly picked off, you'll end up in a 5-on-5. And when you end up in a 5-on-5, after you get map control with your default, that's why you have executes. When you're in a 4-on-4 or a 4-on-3, you generally don't need to execute quite as hard as when you're in a 5-on-5, and so you just want to be executing in these scenarios. Now, on Dust 2, teams, if they give you cat control, generally should lose to your executes. So you should know that. I mean, you have an advantage. Once you get cat control and they're not peeking you and they're not Molotoving you off, you have an inherent advantage. The trouble is that it's sometimes hard to get into this without losing a player. On other maps, if you're in a 5-on-5 and they haven't peeked, you'll be, maybe even, a lot of the time still at quite a big disadvantage. And the goal is to try and pick apart what you need to be doing and executing from there. Now, especially once you're in a 5-on-5 and you've got your default done, or especially when you're in a 4-on-4 or something like that, where you've started to spread out their defense, there should be an idea here of the way you want to be playing it. And the way you generally want to be playing it, there are two ways you can play a 4-on-4 or a 3-on-3. Now, way number one can be to try to pick off their rotator, force him to, not pick him off, but rather push him to the wrong spot and then execute to the other side. So a good example for this, especially in a 4-on-4, is on Dust 2, you'll often have a player on elevator. This is a fairly standard spot. And a lot of the time when you're in a 4-on-4, they'll play like car and elevator, or sometimes they'll give up corner. A lot of teams play it quite differently, but a standard spot in a 5-on-5 specifically is going to be one elevator, one car, one pit. That's very standard. And you really, once you're in that 4-on-4, you have to figure out what their team is playing. But this is just an example of a 5-on-5 spot where you might want to isolate their rotator rather than a 4-on-4 spot, where here you're in a 5-on-5. You've got cat control, and you've got their rotator right here. This is kind of a rotator. They have two rotators a lot of the time on Dust 2. You'll have one elevator, and you'll have one B-side middle. That way they can both support each other. So what you want to be doing a lot of the time is trying to draw this rotator to the wrong site and then hit the other site. And this is something you can do a lot of the time on a ton of maps. For example, Inferno, you can draw the arch player over to B and then hit up A, or you can draw the B rotator over to A and then hit B. That's the type of thing you want to do. So for example, you could throw a smoke out mid, flash out, have one or two guys come out, get control of this area, not peek window, and then leave one here and fall off. And what that's going to do is that's going to draw this rotator over towards the B side of the map, and then you run up cat, and it's much easier to run up cat, and they have to rotate this rotator back into a not great angle and try and get kills. So that's one standard way that you can play out a round. You go into a default, you try and isolate their rotator, you go back and hit the other side of the map where they're at a disadvantage. Now the other way you can play, and I don't see nearly enough strat callers doing this, especially at lower levels, is late round, just walking out an area. Because a lot of the time, this is a strat caller's job as well. When you're in a 3-on-3 or something, and you're on CT side, you can't play these extremities of the map. At least not consistently. For example, if you play a player pushed up right here, or especially back here, he's not only is he alone, but he's on quite a long rotate. So a lot of teams, they'll either have a player here towards long basically alone, or they'll have this player towards long just fall back and play somewhere else and somewhat give up long. And so once you get into that 3v3 scenario, you can just have your team walk out long if you have enough time, because what's going to happen is if he's alone long, he's out of nades essentially. He can't really nade you off. If you're walking out and not making any noise, he doesn't even know you're there. He's just holding an angle. You trade kill on him, or a lot of the time you'll get the entry, and then all of a sudden you're in like a 2-on-2 or a 3-on-2, and you can just run straight to your spot. So this is very good on, for example, long A on Dust 2 specifically. Teams will often walk out mid-late on Cache, even though that seems like a weird area to be walking out. But on Cache, you walk out mid-late because most teams will give up mid-late because they kind of start to stack towards sites, because when the time is late in rounds, mid stops being quite as important on Cache. Somewhat applicable on Mirage, although I wouldn't say it's quite as applicable. There are a ton of spots where this is a very, very solid idea to just get that into a 3v3 if it happens, group up, and walk out an area without making any noise. And this will just get you a trade kill a lot of the time, depending on the area. For example, if a player is playing pit, especially B is a good idea for this. If a player plays back here, walking out B can be incredibly tough. So even though it's like somewhere you could walk out, it is the bomb site. Usually places where people give up are going to be not bomb sites. They might give up mid a little bit. You could walk out mid. They might give up long. You could walk out long. Cache, you could walk out mid. These are areas where there is no bomb site, so teams tend to give it up later into the round and start to stack somewhere else, or they'll push out that area and start to get information. And those are things that on CT side you can call for your team, and on T side you can also counter by calling for your team. And those are things like, especially CT side rotations, that a lot of strat callers, especially newer strat callers, don't really think is their job. What you need to be doing as a strat caller is getting it into your team's head what the ideology of a strat should be, of a setup, where it's like, okay, for example, maybe on, let's say Dust 2. So if you do get in a 3-on-3 and you generally have a player that plays pushed up long, what should the ideology there be for your teammate? Should he be pushing more often than not? Should he be falling back? Should he be staying long late into the round? This is all things you can call as a strat caller and allow your team to kind of set up and know about, instead of just playing as a strat caller on T side. You want to have the idea that as a strat caller, you're kind of dictating the play for your team on both sides. And one thing you want to do, though, is try and put yourself in the scenario where you have to make as few in-game calls as possible, but rather give your team the idea that in certain scenarios, generally you do this unless something else is called. So a great example of that is you don't want to have to call where if you get an entry, especially on a map like Inferno or Overpass, what's going to happen is you're going to get a pick and their team is going to start getting pushy. Because when your team goes down 4-on-5, more often than not, what you want to be doing is either gaining map control or getting a kill back. So you generally want to be taking risks when that happens. That's why oftentimes, if the terrorists start getting picks on the other side of a map, the CT at long will start to push out. And that's not a bad thing, it's a risk, because the terrorist could be sitting outside long waiting for him and just get a kill. But if he pushes out long and nobody's there, then all of a sudden he's got huge map control. So even though you're in a 4-on-5, you've kind of gained back a bit of an advantage by having this CT get into a control of a palm tree area like this, where there's very little they can do, And this is the type of thing you want your team to have as kind of an idea, In this scenario, we're going to push out this area, or I'm going to support you to push out this area, or something like that, or we're just going to turtle up and stack a bomb site or something like that. These are the ideas that plenty of teams think about this differently. They want to do different things in these scenarios, but you need to have it as an idea that in these scenarios, you want to do something, and that's the strat caller's job. So anyways, thanks for watching, and I hope this helped.